my name is Kirsty. Welcome to GEMON's Climate Compact course. Today we tackle climate justice. To understand what climate justice stands for, we first need to look at its basis. With climate change already happening, we have to understand that its effects, though global, will not affect everyone around the world in the same way nor with the same intensity. In other words, climate justice is an issue of equity or lack thereof. Just think of intense rains that may cause a flood. In a developed country, measures to adapt to it and mitigate its effects are most probably to be under place. They have the resources to do so. The local population is more engaged and empowered to request it, and access to information allows for people to be better prepared as to how to react. These are only a few aspects. In the developing world, nonetheless, the aforementioned issues are, to say the least, lacking. Just a random example, the Peruvian Andes. In many places of that area, people have chopped down the natural forests that used to cover the slopes of the mountains while living at the base of these. They do so to get timber as a resource for their livelihoods. But due to this, the rainy season at the beginning of each year comes with floods. Yes, every year, towns are destroyed, lives are lost. And what has been done about it? Not much really. The country's capacities are mainly focused on response after the disaster happens, but never on preventing and adapting to them. There is not a strong policy to inform and educate people as to the consequences of deforestation. There are not mitigation measures to channel flooding waters coming to the towns and so on. Quite different scenarios, right? This is just to illustrate the different capacities between a country in the global north and one in global south. And thus we can begin to understand what climate justice stands for. In a nutshell, climate justice focuses on bringing light to the fact that the causes and effects of climate change, as well as the efforts to tackle it, raise ethical, equity and rights issues. Moreover, climate justice aims to highlight that there is a huge need to disrupt the current power relations and shift the decision-making process which lock in and reproduce climate injustices. In other words, the negative effects of climate change are not and will not be felt equitably among people. It will be very dependent on where you live, and saying it without filters, on where you stand in the social economic pyramid. Now let's have a deeper look at the most obvious problems that will be seen or felt in a non-equitable world. For that, let us understand the concept of cascading effects of climate change. With the changes in climate, the functioning and characteristics of ecosystems will be affected, and these will bring further consequences to humans' livelihoods. Just think of the reduction of precipitation or the increase of temperature or both. For agricultural systems, this will negatively affect the productivity, both regarding quantity and quality. If these are affected, prices will increase and access to food will become a bigger issue. But even in this case, farmers and consumers in the developed world will have more tools and resources to adapt and decrease these impacts, making food security less of an issue than in countries facing higher levels of poverty or more marginalized communities. How can these cascading effects manifest? Not only on agricultural systems, of course. They can manifest within the cryosphere with the coverage of snow, glaciers, or lake ice shrinking or completely disappearing. We already studied the albedo and what the loss of ice and snow coverage means regarding adding up to the heating of the globe. The marine physical systems will also be affected with sea level rises, sea temperatures, currents, etc. And this can have effects from flooding in coastal areas to a reduction on the marine resources. Terrestrial physical systems will also be affected, and this means soil erosion, land degradation, or desertification, which in turn will hit our agricultural sector to start with. Freshwater physical systems will also be affected, including the water flow and volumes, making water access an issue that can trigger further bigger social problems. With all these systems affected, there will be an undeniable reduction on the available resources, thus influencing the biodiversity decline, lower agricultural and fishery productivity, and more. At the same time, Another cascading effect will be the intensification of extreme events with heat and cold waves, hurricanes, and so on. These cascading effects will not be the same everywhere, but neither will be the impacts to the societies affected by them. Needless to say, the Global South countries are much more affected by climate change, so much so that 8 out of 10 countries most affected by extreme weather events between 1998 and 2017 were developing countries. But how do we identify vulnerability? According to Oxfam and Stockholm Environmental Institute, it is vital to recognize that income-based carbon inequalities are intertwined with and reinforce other power structures associated with income, race, age, and occupation. As to income, think of countries with the hot weather and how poorer households are more likely to be exposed to higher temperatures than the richer ones. As to race, for instance, the white people tend to be overrepresented among the highest income groups, while people of color amongst the lowest. This easily highlights a cycle of long-standing inequalities. Then you have the age factor. In Canada, 8 in 10 premature deaths from heat-related causes are in victims aged 60 and above. Finally, the vulnerability in line with occupation. This can be seen, for example, in India, where outdoor workers in sectors like agriculture and construction, comprising 75% of the workforce, and in the case of agriculture, employing 80% of economically active women, are particularly exposed in a country that could be the first to see heat waves that cross the survivability limit for a healthy person. Following these vulnerability indicators alongside the effects of climate change, we can map the more vulnerable places and populations. Germanwatch does so on a yearly basis by producing the Global Climate Risk Index. What does it show? That less developed countries are generally more affected than industrialized countries. Regarding future climate change, the Climate Risk Index may serve as a red flag for already existing vulnerability that may further increase in regions where extreme events will become more frequent or more severe due to climate change. As we saw, income, race, age, and occupation are indicators that allow us to easily grasp inequalities as to how some are more vulnerable than others. But we also should keep an eye for those who are disproportionately vulnerable. Two main groups are of special concern here. Indigenous populations represent one of them. They tend to be strongly dependent on their surrounding natural resources for their daily livelihoods, and we know that these will be heavily impacted by climate change. Moreover, indigenous populations live in regions and ecosystems that are most exposed to the impacts of climate change. Not only that, but they also face an overall reality of economic disadvantage, with further low levels of access to resources and technology for adapting and mitigating. The other group is gender-based. If you add the gender factor to the equation, women's vulnerability is particularly exacerbated. According to Oxfam's research, in poorer countries, women and girls of reproductive age were found to be more likely to live in low-income households, while poverty and deprivation have been found among women in non-poor households. How can this disproportionate vulnerability be seen? In Canada, for instance, with First Nations. First Nations are groups of Canadian Indigenous people who live south of the tree line and mainly south of the Arctic Circle. There are 634 recognized First Nations. According to the Minority Rights Group International, people living in the First Nations have 33 times higher chances to be displaced due to wildfires. As to women, according to the Minority Rights Group International, in Kenya, prolonged droughts are increasing poverty and hunger, leading to families who aim to survive, giving away girls as young as the age of 12 in exchange for cattle. The case of Bangladesh is one that illustrates most examples of vulnerability. Temperature increase is already leading to longer summers, warmer winters, and unpredictable monsoons. Not only that, but sea levels are also expected to rise up to 1.5 meters along the coastline. In this scenario, Bangladesh women are being forced into sexual labor in order to survive and are more likely than ever to suffer sexual violence. So what can this vulnerability all over bring about? In order to survive, migration is one of the keys to the most vulnerable. We can already see an increase in the numbers of migrants globally. By 2019, there were more than 272 million migrants globally, almost 120 million more than 20 years ago. And among the reasons to migrate are the economic disadvantages, the political and social problems such as persecution or war, and environmental issues such as increase of natural disasters like floods. How exactly do these factors work towards this ever-increasing migration? The push and pull factors of migration give us a good understanding. Migration usually happens as a result of a combination of a push factor and pull factor. For example, you want to move out of a country that politically persecutes those who are against a dictator. Therefore, you look for a country where you can be free and express yourself calmly. Now, among the push and pull factors, the ones related to climate change are becoming more recurrent. For example, floods, droughts, or failing crops are pushing people deeper into poverty. The result, migration towards places with more fertile lands or lower risk from natural hazards. Where are such places to migrate? Well, that depends, but they are not always to a different country or a different continent. We tend to focus on the migrants trying to cross the Mexican-American border, or on those trying to access Europe through Turkey or Mediterranean. But in truth, over half of the people that migrate do so internally. Just think of the people migrating from the rural to urban areas, looking for better living standards or economic opportunities. So now we get the basics of climate justice. But there was one issue we mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, that of ethics. Yes, climate change is also an ethical issue, and climate justice tries to address that. What do we mean exactly? The least affected by climate change will end up being those who have contributed the most to making it happen. That is carbon inequality. From 1990 to 2015, annual emissions grew 60% and cumulative emissions doubled. Out of this increase, the richest 10% of the world, around 630 million people, were responsible for 52% of the cumulative carbon emissions, depleting the global carbon budget by 31%. In the meantime, the poorest 50%, around 3.1 billion people, was responsible for just 7% of the cumulative emissions and used just 4% of the available carbon budget. This figure you are currently seeing stratifies the population according to income in groups of 5%. And it is rather noticeable how, as your income capacities are higher, you are exponentially increasing your contribution to emissions. And especially more so if you consider that the light green bar represents the emissions that population ranged back in 1990, while the dark green is for 2015. While emissions for the richer kept on dramatically increasing, the poorer barely increased them. And once more, they will be the ones suffering the most. So coming to an end, what to do? Inclusion is a must. Inclusive climate action, in other words, to reduce climate change impacts on the vulnerable and ensure that the economic, environmental, and social benefits and burdens of the climate action are equitably shared. To achieve so, advocacy is critical. Whether you are more or less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, you need to raise your voice. It is about justice for all, and we need to pressure policymakers if changes are to happen. Have a look in your own country or region as to who are the most vulnerable, and see to contact any association collaborating with them. Learn about their vulnerability, listen to their voices, and help make those voices louder to the point that no other thing than actions and solutions come about. We are all in this together.